Hello, everyone.
Welcome to the Davis Center 75th.
Well, we are as excited as you are for this very special anniversary celebration and reunion. My name is Marika Alexeyeva, and I'm a graduate of RICA program of 2015. And I remember my time at the Davis Center super fondly, and of course, first most, for immediate access to some of the most remarkable, world-renowned faculty that we all had such a privilege working closely with. I also remember RICA Lounge and all the animated discussions that we've had with my very talented, thank you, fellow students in the lounge. And not the least, as if it was yesterday, I remember my New Year's Eve here in CJ's basement working on my thesis.
Good memories. And I'm Nicole Carter, and I'm a graduate of Harvard College of 2013. And while at Harvard, I studied Russian, and I also did my honors thesis on the Chechen diaspora in Moscow. And while I was an undergraduate, I spent a lot of time at the Davis Center, as I found it to be such a warm and welcoming place. And the Davis Center really inspired me and empowered me to study in the region. And I'm so grateful for all of their support while in Cambridge and abroad and beyond, and for all of the experiences and relationships that the Davis Center has given me.
And we are so honored to be once again introducing speakers at the Davis Center anniversary. In fact, last time we did it 5 years ago. We've been impatiently waiting for opportunity ever since.
Very impatiently. Mm-hmm. And today, and now it is my honor to introduce Eve Blau. And Eve Blau is the faculty director of the Davis Center and a professor in the Graduate School of Design, who specializes in the history of urban form and design, and also theory of urban form and design. And Professor Blau also co-directs the Harvard Mellon Urban Institute, which is a university-wide initiative that fosters innovative approaches to the study of cities and urban design. Her research engages in a number of issues in urban history and also touches the rapidly changing socio-political, environmental, and technological conditions that reorganize the built environment. And Professor Blau has written many books on a number of post-socialist cities, such as Zagreb, Baku, and Red Vienna, and is now preparing a course on sustainable reconstruction in Ukraine, and is thinking about how post-war reconstruction efforts of the past can inform planning for the future.
And I'm so pleased to introduce Alexandra Vakru, who is the executive director of the Davis Center for the last 13 years. And she also oversees the master's program. And as her former master's student, I can tell you, as you already know, she is absolutely amazing professor. And all of her students really admire and respect her. She is a remarkable scholar and somehow always manages to stay on top of the most cutting-edge Russian Eurasia policy issues. And not the least, it's been my experience too, she is inordinately caring for all her graduate students. So Alexandra has a PhD in political science, and she has spent most of the past 18 months actively studying the war and preparing a class that she will be teaching on the war in Ukraine this spring.
Ooh, can we take that?
I hope so. She also launched the Center's Scholars Without Borders program for Ukrainian, Russian, and Belarusian scholars displaced by the war. So she says that she will be very happy to talk to anyone and everyone about it at any point during this weekend.
And now over to you, Eve and Alexandra.
Nice, thanks. Whoops. Thank you very much. That was a lovely introduction. And so as you know, I'm Eve Blau, I'm the faculty director. And it's actually my very great pleasure to welcome you all to this celebration of the Davis Center's 75th anniversary. And there's a great deal, as you know, to celebrate about the past 75 years. And as we mark the 75th, we project forward to the 80th and beyond, of course, because the Davis Center is a very resilient and dynamic institution that will continue, as we know, for ever. And the Davis Center, just to mention some of the incredible achievements of the Davis Center, there are the untold volumes of important and really original academic research that have been produced here and during this time. And there are hundreds, as we know, of students and scholars who have passed through our doors, graduate students, undergraduates, visiting scholars. And there's also a community of postdocs who have spent time at the center and who have contributed an enormous amount to our interdisciplinary conversation about the region. And the Davis Center, even more importantly, the Davis Center community, the larger Davis Center community, which as we know is very large, have collectively contributed an inordinate amount, actually, to the understanding of our region. And I think that's very important. The outreach, actually, and the extension of the interests and the activities of the Davis Center. So we really owe you all a round of applause. So please join me. So the program that we have for you today both exemplifies and celebrates this rich tradition of generating and sharing knowledge. And we're very grateful that so many of our faculty and alumni and colleagues and community members who have agreed to speak and share their expertise and their experience with us. And we look forward to a fantastic, and as you've seen, a very full day. So now I would like to hand things over to my colleague, my dear colleague, Alexandra Vacru, who, as you know, is the executive director of the center. Alexandra.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I trust the champagne breakfast has taken effect. Everyone is ready to listen to experts talk about what they know best. I echo Eve's pleasure in welcoming everyone here, welcoming everyone back to the Davis Center, to the RICA program, to the Soviet Union program. We are very happy to have you, but we have a lot of work to do. So as much as I would like to go on and talk about how wonderful we are, I won't. I do want to point out that even though we have a lot to celebrate, this comes in the middle of a very challenging time when a lot of very difficult things are happening. And as has traditionally been the motto of the Davis Center and of the Russian Research Center, we are not going to shy away from those difficult issues. And in fact, we're going to spend most of the day talking about them. As a result, we need to move on. There's not much time for me to introduce the speakers, and you'll notice throughout the day we're going to have extremely succinct introductions so that we can get to the actual meat of our panels. You all know where to find them online if you need to get more information. But let me start with Sergei Guriev, who has been the provost at Sciences Po since 2002. He joined the university as 2022. I saw that look, yeah. He joined the university As a tenured professor in economics in 2013, after serving as the rector of the new economics school in Moscow from 2004 to 2013. However, from 2016 to 2019, he was on leave and served as the chief economist of the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, where he was also a member of the executive committee. Sergei has continued to do his research, and his interests include political economies of populism and autocracy. You may have seen the 2002 book he co-authored with Dan Treisman, Spin Dictators, The Changing Face of Tyranny in the 21st Century. It's now been translated into 13 languages, I think, and with very good reason. Sergei is one of those rare academics that's able to translate jargony economics and very mathy models into something that we can all understand. And I can't think of anyone better to bring that ability, his personal experience of Russia, and his knowledge of what is going on in the world to us as a keynote speaker. Sergei.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alexandra, for this generous introduction. For me, it's a great honor to be here. It's a great pleasure. I think the first time I spoke in Davis Center was 1997, so many of you have not been to school yet. Some of you have already graduated, I see. And I think the last time I spoke here was 15 years ago. The world has changed. Today, we agreed that I'll talk for about half an hour, and then so we have time for questions. And the modest title of the talk is Everything You Ought to Know About Putin and What Comes Next. So in one slide, I'll show you what I think has been the history of Putin's regime from an economist's point of view. I think understanding economics is very important for understanding popularity and stability, sustainability, and durability of Putin's regime. We, in this book, Spin Dictators that you mentioned, we build models of modern autocracies. The book is a book for a general audience, but it's based on regressions, data. And there we show that modern non-democratic regimes really benefit from economic performance, or at least perceived economic performance. That's why spin is so important in those regimes. Not only you want to deliver in economic terms, but you also want to probably convince people that you're delivering even better, and definitely better than the alternative. So basically, the brief history of Putin's economy and political economy in the last 20 years is very simple. So when Putin comes to power, which we can count as August 1999, Russian economy is at the lowest point after the crisis. A lot of people are unemployed, incomes are low, ruble is very weak, which actually helps competitiveness of Russian economy. You have a lot of unused capacity, and so Putin, in that sense, is lucky to be there at the right time and starts counting from 1999. This is one of the best 10 years in Russian economic history, if not the best. The data on 1920s are not as good, but basically this is the decade which you can only compare to post-Civil War recovery in 1920s, the decade of new economic policy. So we are talking about doubling GDP. So average growth rate at this period was about 7% per year. Incomes, in real terms, adjusted for inflation, incomes and wages were growing even faster. They more than tripled in those 10 years. And so we should not be surprised that Putin was very popular in those years. He used that to consolidate his political regime. He removed checks and balances. He took control of various elements of political, judiciary, and media landscape. He was also lucky because that was the time of global commodity boom. China was continuing to grow and already was big enough to play a very important role as a buyer of commodities, in particular oil. So before that, China was growing fast, but it was not big enough. After that, China slowed down. But that was the golden time of 10 years of growing oil prices, which actually contributed to at least half of this 7% growth, as we show in our paper with Oleg Tsivinsky in 2010. So the other thing which I would say is much of this growth can be attributed to reforms which were conducted in the 1990s and also continued into the first term of Vladimir Putin's rule. We can talk about Putin simplifying tax system, Putin introducing property rights for land, deregulating business environment, opening up to investment, stabilizing macroeconomic environment, creating prudential regulation of banks, deposit insurance, paying off external debt, and therefore creating indeed preconditions for private sector to grow. And this is exactly what happened. Now, the second part of the story is what happened 2008, 2009. 2009 was not a good year for Russia. Russian government has made some policy mistakes. Russian GDP went down quite a bit. If you have questions, I can talk about it, but let me actually skip forward. Basically, the story is that after this fall, Russian economy started to recover, but it was already clear in 2008 that the growth model of Putin's first decade was running out of steam. This model was based on growing oil prices. Oil prices recovered after the crisis, but did not go up further. This model was based on continuing reforms, and if anything, after 2003, 2004, Putin started to introduce what we can call Putinomics, the system where economy is controlled by the state and friends of Putin, where corruption plays a role, state corporations play a role, and reforms are actually rolled back, if anything. And so not surprisingly, we saw that growth after the initial recovery in 2010, 11, and 12 started to slow down. And actually in 2013, the growth was already just 1% per year. So Russia entered the epoch of stagnation. Now, what happened in the 10 years after, between 2013 and 2022, is what Oleg Savinsky and I call the 70-80 scenario, when we said, well, after the crisis, if you don't have reforms, and we already talked about that in 2010, in 2009 actually, that if you don't reform any further, Russian growth model will run out of steam. And even if oil prices stay at $70 or $80 per barrel, you will have macroeconomic stability, but you'll have no growth. And you'll go back to 1970s, 1980s and have Brezhnevist stagnation, zastoy. And that's exactly what happened in objective numbers. Macroeconomic environment it's been excellent. Sometimes people call it macroeconomic fortress Russia, but Russia got into middle income trap. I'll show you a graph which we first built with Ekaterina Zhuravsky in the paper, which explains why Russia is not South Korea in 2010. What we said there, we said, let's compare Russian and Korean GDP trajectory with the 11 years gap. So Korea was growing fast. Before 1997, 1998, it was the crisis of the famous Asian crisis. And then Korea restructured its institutions and escaped from the middle income trap. Today, Korea is a competitive, post-industrial, knowledge-based economy. I also worked on this as an economist. I can tell you that lots of things have changed in 1998. That was a wake-up call, that the model based on crony capitalist institutions of chaebols having preferential access to finance, and the economy which was discriminating against non-chaebol businesses and foreign investors had to be reformed, and it was reformed. And we say that 10 years ago, we said that Russia is like South Korea before the crisis. You see there is a parallel line of Russian GDP trajectory. But if there is no reform, Russia will stagnate, and that's exactly what happened. So if you compare these trajectories after the crisis, Korea has reformed and escaped middle income trap, while Russia got stuck in this stagnation scenario. And that was already obvious at that point. So why is this important when we talk about 2013? Because, of course, 2013 was a precursor to 2014, and 2014 for Putin was an important reference point for 2022. So it's not just economics, it's also politics. And the fact that growth was slowing down also played a role for Putin's popularity. So let me show you the incomes dynamics, which is in particular very important. So GDP dynamics here, we take the pre-crisis point as 100, and you see that GDP has recovered after the crisis and then stagnated. But what happened to real incomes of Russian citizens? 2012 was a great year. And then incomes started to fall and actually recovered only partially. Now they're a bit higher than 2012, 2013. But overall, this was not a good a good 10 years for Russian households, and Putin's popularity in 2013 in particular was actually coming down. Now, global standing of Russia was also not doing well. This 10 years was 10 years when Russian economy was shrinking as a part of the global economy. Putin may say whatever he wants, but if you actually look at share of Russia in the global economy, it was higher than share of India. But now it's actually much lower. So it used to be 3% of a global economy. Now it's 1.7% of a global economy. At the same time, China, with all the problems, all the slowdown of the last decade, is growing as a share of global economy. Now, let me talk about the political economy, how economics is related to politics. So for us, the first 20 years were exactly the construction of what we call spin dictatorship. My publisher says, wherever you speak, you have to talk about the book. But this time it's actually relevant. And basically, this is a long book. It has a lot of references and footnotes, but in one word, the idea is very simple. Modern dictators are not what they used to be. The 20th century dictators would use fear, would use open repression, would be proud of being dictators. Dictators in the last 30 years have become much more like imperfect Democrats. They pretend to be Democrats. They don't wear military or paramilitary uniform. They wear business suits. They travel to Davos. They shake hands with democratic leaders and they say, we are like you and you're like us. We are popular. We don't repress people. Whenever we repress people, we deny it. Whenever we censor again in a deniable way. And in the book, we talk a lot about those toolkits, which are very sophisticated. We talk about pioneers of the model. And Putin is not a pioneer, but he's one of the best, most sophisticated spin dictators in the world. Basically, that per se created this stable system, which initially was based on this 10 years of economic success. And later on, when popularity has come down, Putin actually had to create something new, some new model of legitimacy. And of course, we know what happened in 2014. He annexed Crimea. So this is a chart which is very relevant for something like a spin dictator model. It's a popularity of Putin. In the book, we talk a lot to what extent polls reflect popularity in spin dictatorships. And we would say that there is a bias. We can actually try to measure it with what's called list experiments. So when Putin has 70% popularity, the real popularity is probably 65 or 60. Yet this bias doesn't really change over time. And so you can actually look at this chart as a driver of how Putin conducts his policy. And you see that the popularity of Putin is always in between 60 and 80. You have this monetization of social benefits and the first Orange Revolution. Then you see, as economic growth was slowing down, as I mentioned, Putin's popularity went down all the way to historic low of 60. In this chart, which is Levada's poll, which is run for those 20 plus years. And then you have Crimea, which worked beautifully for the reasons we will be talking about today, all day, I imagine. And then, of course, economic growth did not come back, and legitimacy based on this imperial narrative started to fade away. There was another policy mistake, which I think is very important, which is raising retirement age was, I think, a policy mistake. Putin did not need to do that, but dictators do make mistakes, and that cost him. And also, I would say a very important part is this model of Putin is based on television propaganda, and initially it was very incompetent to handle social media. This is also something I do research on. I can talk more about this, but Russian opposition using social media, and especially YouTube, did create major problems for Putin. Before Alexei Navalny was poisoned, he was actually reaching out every Thursday to millions of people on his YouTube channel. And of course, he was already challenging propaganda. During COVID, Putin's popularity took another hit. And you see, this is exactly when he tried to kill Alexei Navalny, then put him in jail. And I guess after 2022, after the beginning of the war, you don't really need to look at this graph anymore because it's not directly comparable. Why? Because we think that Putin's regime is no longer a spin dictatorship, it's a fear dictatorship. So before 2022, there was already a trend towards fear dictatorship. Navalny initially was in jail under house arrest, under accusations of fraud, tax evasion. That's a typical spin dictatorship's tactic, saying we don't have political prisoners. These guys are just crooks, and they're in jail because they're crooks. But after 2021, they started to say that Navalny's organization is an extremist organization. So Navalny was actually becoming a political prisoner officially. But the main transformation, of course, happened in the first week of the war, which was the week where Putin saw that his plan to replay 2014 quickly, without brutalities, take over Kiev, change the government, and have another Crimea, have an increase in popularity without major economic implications, because he would think that the West would be disunited and weak and slow. So that was the plan, and then he saw it's not working, and that's when he closed down all independent media, where he introduced military censorship, blocked Facebook and Instagram. Well, sometimes people say it's not bad to turn off Facebook and Instagram, but in Russia, social media are actually a platform which help to circumvent censorship. And so that was the transition. And this transition happened exactly in February, March 2022. Now, what was important about these 10 years of political economy was indeed that Putin could not relaunch economic growth, because for that he needed reforms. For reforms, he would have to allow economic competition and openness, which would actually create problems for his governance model. And so as he was presiding over stagnating economy, he was trying to sell this narrative that economy is not growing, but without me, it would be even worse. And of course, he had some credibility, which was coming from these first 10 years of Putin's economic success, which was spectacular. And citizens believed him less and less, seeing that things are not going in the right direction. But yet, his popularity was still pretty high. Now, one thing which we do, and this is not part of the book, but one of the papers we wrote before writing this book, we can actually measure the contribution of censorship to Putin's popularity. And whenever we say that Putin's popularity is something like 60 or 70, about half of that can be explained by internet censorship and traditional media censorship. So we can actually quantify those things, and we would say that there is a reason why Putin used this model, why he relied on censorship. He used censorship, which was a hidden censorship. For people in this room, there is no doubt that Putin started to take over media the minute he came to power. But for Russians living in Russia, it was not that obvious. When you look at surveys around the world, people in Russia, for that matter in China as well, but polls in China is a different matter. But people in Russia would say, well, some of our media are not free, but things are not that bad. To a greater extent than in countries like France, Germany, or the United States, where people don't think that media are free. So in any event, what happened afterwards, so this stagnation was not a great economic period. But Putin, as I said, understood very well that he needs to build this macroeconomic fortress Russia. He moved to inflation targeting macroeconomic framework. In terms of macroeconomic policy making, monetary policy and fiscal policy, Russia would do exactly what textbooks would tell Russia to do. In that sense, it's not surprising that Russian macroeconomic situation was quite stable. Russia had low debt. Russia had low external debt. Russia piled up currency reserves, sovereign wealth fund. And so it's not like Putin was building macroeconomic fortress Russia to prepare for the war, but for him it was important to be independent, to have strategic agency. I'm sure we'll talk about this today a lot. For Putin, it is important to say, like United States, and he would say, unlike Europe, but like United States and China, Russia is a strategically independent player. We don't need to call IMF and ask for permission to do something. We have enough macroeconomic stability to avoid doing that. Now, I'll just briefly would say that now we talk about sanctions and the impact of sanctions. I'll say a few words in a couple of minutes. But in 2014, we thought that the West is introducing important sanctions, and especially that happened in the second half of 2014. The impact of those sanctions was not zero, but it was very, very small. So, of course, in 2022, it is a completely different ballgame with thousands of sanctions imposed on Russia. Russia has more sanctions imposed on its economy than all other countries in the world combined. In 2014, sanctions were much less impactful. When Russian economy is growing at 1% per year, the 1% total for 5 years is both not negligible, but also not crazily important. So, what happened in 2022? It was a completely different set of tools. And so when you ask a question, to what extent sanctions which were communicated to Putin before the war, stopped the war and could have stopped the war, we saw that many things that happened were not expected by Putin. So Putin thought that dollar can be weaponized, but he didn't think that euro could be weaponized. And so we saw that Putin was moving some of his assets in sovereign wealth fund, in central bank currency reserves, from dollars to other currencies, and in particular euros, but not all, and not at sufficient speed, and probably central bankers were not aware of Putin's plans to invade Ukraine in February 2022. So what happened, even though the market was expecting something like war with some probability before February, and ruble was taking a hit before February, the impact was not large, and the market was expecting something like turning off SWIFT, which is not a catastrophic impact as we see today. But what has happened was something pretty unprecedented. The sanctions against Russian central bank took place on the third day of the war, and Russian central bank got immobilized assets for about $300 billion. Then we started to talk about oil sanctions right away, but US introduced oil embargo, UK introduced oil embargo, but these were not very important because US and UK did not buy Russian oil in any significant amounts. But Europe only introduced sanctions in December 2022. And for the whole 2022, Putin continued to sell oil, and he got almost all of this $300 billion back. Well, 230 billion trade surplus. This is the number from 2022. So Putin lost some money on the third day of the war, but he recovered a lot of money by selling oil and benefiting from high oil prices in 2022. Eventually, oil sanctions took place and did hit Putin. Now, the third day of the war, sanctions on central bank triggered macroeconomic panic, and that was the time when people started to talk about the destructive impact on complete deterioration of Russian economy in the year to come. And this is just for you the forecast that were in place in the March, April, in the spring 2022. And you see that these forecasts were quite catastrophic. Again, if you compare to the impact on Ukrainian economy, which lost about a third of its GDP in 2022, these are not big numbers. But yet, the reality was much more muted, and the decline of GDP in 2022 is minus 2%, and the recovery in 2023 is also plus 2%, so Russian economy is now back to pre-war level. So why? There are several explanations. One is when people started to panic in March, they didn't realize how quickly, in a repressive state, competent policymakers can restore macroeconomic stability. That was done reasonably quickly. A lot of Russian financial instruments were immobilized, markets were closed for weeks. But overall, these forecasts were based on models which should not be used because that was an uncharted territory. What happened to Russia in 2022 is something that we've not seen before in many ways. So these forecasts were not precise by definition. Now, the other thing is the high oil prices and influx of petrodollars during 2022. It was an important factor giving Putin money to continue this war. And finally, when we look at GDP, it's not a good measure. In peacetime, GDP is a reasonably good measure of economic performance. In wartime, of course, what happens? You produce weapons and munitions, You pay for them from the budget, but these weapons and munitions don't contribute to quality of life, don't contribute to future economic growth. They are shipped to Ukraine where they are destroyed. And so this share of GDP is actually not a measure which should be taken into account when we look at quality of life. If we look at some other measures, in 2022, you did find some indicators. For example, consumer spending in comparable prices went down by 10% in 2022. So some measures quality of life did go down substantially. Now, what next? So let me talk about now about future of Putin's regime and then say a few words about what comes after. So I think that we now are in a very depressing moment where sanctions stopped working. In the sense that sanctions do work. They did have an impact on ruble. They did have impact on inflation. They did have impact on budget for the first half of 2023. That's the time when Putin's oil and gas revenues came down by half year on year. It's a substantial impact, which reduces his capacity to finance this war. And then Putin, months after months, started to learn how to circumvent those sanctions. It's costly. He needs to hire intermediaries. He needs to buy those rusty shadow tankers. That's dangerous for the global environment. That's a different story. But overall, we see how he's no longer running a budget deficit today. And so this is actually quite important. So in the third quarter, he starts to get oil price, which is above oil price cap. His budget deficit is actually disappearing. If anything, in the last month, he's running a surplus. And this is why the budget he's planning for the next year is really scary. He's talking about moving from 4% of GDP defense spending to 6% of GDP defense spending. I would remind you that in NATO, the debate is that countries should go to 2% of GDP defense spending because half of NATO countries before 2022 would spend less than 2% of GDP on defense spending. So will he be able to fund it if we don't tighten the oil sanctions? I think he will. He still has some reserves in yuan, which they can sell, and they do sell those reserves to fund the budget deficit if budget deficits comes up. And in that sense, we may see a continuing war. We may see the situation where Putin actually ramps up production of weapons and munitions, spend some of the petrodollars to buy drones from Iran, technology from the US through 5 layers of intermediaries, which makes it more expensive, but he has the petrodollars. He can buy artillery shells from Kim, from North Korea. And all of that, I think, is completely financeable if we don't tighten the sanctions. So this is the pessimistic note. In the long run, situation in Putin's economy is not great. Capital outflow, lack of access to modern technology, problems in the civil sector. All of that creates major problems for the long-term economic growth. But Putin is no longer in the regime where he cares about citizens' quality of life because he has repressive apparatus and openly threatens people with multi-year prison terms. This is just a forecast from IMF before the war and after the war, and you see that Russia in 2026 will have a GDP by about 7-8 percentage points lower than it would have if Putin did not start this full-scale invasion. Now, once again, some people would say, is Putin's regime now spin dictatorship or fear dictatorship? I would say there is still some elements of spin because he was building this system for 20 years. You cannot transition in a couple of years back to the old 20th century model, and you still have people who work in opposition parties and with opposition parties. You still have people who run elections. You still have the whole Department of Internal Politics, Domestic Politics is in administration of the president. So you have these elements which remain. Overall, it's a fear regime, but you still have multi-party elections. You still have some elements which remind the spin dictatorship system. But overall, it's pretty much an openly repressive system where if you say something, which I just said today, you may go to jail for many years. And of course, number of political prisoners is much higher than it used to be and is now already comparable to late Soviet Union. So now on what comes next, we don't know. We really don't know. But Putin is mortal. He almost died 3 years ago. If we believe Telegram channels, he may have died. Actually, we don't know. I remind you, Sasha mentioned I was working in the BRD. We saw how President Karimov, who ran the country for 30 years, was dead and undead at the same time for a week before we actually learned that he literally passed away. But for a week, people knew he's dead, but official standing was he's not dead. And so maybe Putin has disappeared already, but maybe not. The moment he disappeared, technically he will be succeeded by people around him. There is no magic. Somebody from the close circle will take power collectively or personalistically. I believe that we are not likely to see another Putin because Putin has presided over 20 years of rule, including 10 years of enormous economic success. He has popularity. Probably it's not a majority of Russian society that supports Putin. In the last pre-war polls that we saw, Levada would run polls in fall 2021, and 30% of Russians would say they would vote for Putin. How many Russians would vote for older Patrushev, younger Patrushev, or other corrupt KGB generals? We probably think that 0 is the right answer. And in that sense, we'll see some probably collegial junta, collegial effort, maybe with some figurehead as a president. And none of them is charismatic enough and popular enough to replace Putin as a Putin 2.0. So whatever we know from studies of non-democratic regimes, we think that there'll be some infighting because Putin also selected these people to hate each other and distrust each other. That was his job. And he has done a good job in that. So there'll be some infighting, some defenestration, some strange deaths, some departures from Moscow to Venezuela or Africa. That is something that we'll probably see. However, we will not see recreation of full-scale ideological repressive regime. It's not, I cannot rule it out. We've seen many things that are surprising in the last couple of years. But it's just hard to imagine how these people who love yachts and castles would try to build a Stalinist governance system. And again, Putin selected them for that as well because he himself likes yachts and he doesn't like people who love ideology to run the country for him. And in that sense, I think what is more likely is after months and probably a couple of years, again, we don't know how many years, could be much longer than a couple of years. We will see something like perestroika. What is the logic of new perestroika, new liberalization? It's very simple. One corrupt KGB general knows that he is no different from another corrupt KGB general. In order to become more stable as a ruler, I'm saying he because they're all men, he will try to get some public support. He needs to reach out to people in the street. And for that, he needs some economic success. And the easiest way to economic success is, of course, removing sanctions. And for that, they will need to reach out to the West. They don't like this war at all. As I mentioned, these are people who like palaces and yachts. And they will reach out to the West and they will try to negotiate something. And this is where the West should demand, of course, a withdrawal of troops, reestablishing Ukrainian territorial integrity back to 1991 borders, reparations, international tribunal for war criminals, but also liberalization of Russian political life, releasing political prisoners, and opening up political system for internal competition. Why is that important? Because, of course, that sustainable, durable peace in Europe and in Ukraine will only be possible when Russia is democratic. Nobody can impose democracy on Russia. I think Russia, unlike 1945, or Germany or Japan, will not be occupied. It's a nuclear power. But with the tools, instruments like sanctions, a lot can be done. And incentives to remove sanctions can be used to open up Russian political system and create another chance for Russian society to build a democratic and peaceful country. I'll stop here on this positive note. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergei Maratovich. I often when talks are given, I try to find a sort of a logical chink or something that was unexplained or not properly explained. This was a magnificent talk. Thank you very, very much. I would just ask if you could talk a little bit more, very generally, about Western policy now, a little bit more specifically about what we should be doing with sanctions. And if and when Putinism ends, are there main lessons from the 1990s that the West should have learned that you can talk briefly about? Thank you very much.
Right, thank you. So right now I think it's crucial to help Ukraine win this war. I'm not sure how realistic that is, but the West should provide more weapons to Ukraine faster. The West should provide more money to Ukraine. That's been done. Ukrainian economy is resilient, which is quite surprising to a lot of people given the cost, given the economic and security cost that was imposed in the last couple of years, and millions of people have left. And on the other hand, if we talk about Russia, I think it's crucial, and we'll talk about this today. It's crucial to tighten the sanctions, both technology sanctions and oil sanctions. Now, technology sanctions very hard. If you produce a microprocessor in the United States, through 1, 2, 3, 5 intermediaries, Putin will be able to get it and put it inside a missile which will kill Ukrainians. It's costly, and it's good that it's costly. The costlier it is, the harder it is for Putin to buy more of those microprocessors. So that's important. And the Western governments should continue talking to third countries such as Kazakhstan, Turkey, Emirates, but also to India and China, and sometimes use secondary sanctions. That's been done, but very little. One thing which has happened, Europe now is using secondary sanctions. Europe ideologically opposed secondary sanctions until 2022. In 2022, they introduced this instrument and started to use it. So this is good. More of that needs to be done. On oil, oil price cap is in place, but Russia learned how to circumvent it, and US should re-engage with India and China and said it's in your interest. If you pay Russian oil suppliers, you should pay $60 per barrel. And ideally, we would recommend reducing this price lower. I see Craig is in the audience. We co-authored a paper for a Yermak Makful group where we actually advocate that oil price cap should be going down. And yet, even enforcing 60 is not easy, as we see. But basically, the idea of oil price cap is to shift oil rent from Russia to India. Basically, India says, my friend Vladimir, I would like to pay you 80, but evil Americans threaten secondary sanctions, so I'm forced to pay you 60. And when India does that, India refines this oil and sells the refined products to Europe for euros, not for rupees, but for euros at a market price. So that's the idea. And in principle, it's incentive compatible, but more needs to be done with the non-Western partners. Now, on the main lessons from 1990s, I think the West made mistakes in 1990s, but of course the main responsibility is with the Russians. And when we think about mistakes of the West, I think the big mistake was lack of a Marshall Plan for Russia. Some people would say that EBRD was like a Marshall Plan for Russia. Russia was welcome to EBRD, IMF, World Bank, and so on, but the magnitude is just not much. Russia should have defaulted on Soviet debt. I think that was Poland actually restructured external debt. Russia did not. Russia did lack financial support, but on the other hand, Russian government occasionally was quite corrupt, occasionally quite incompetent. Many mistakes have been made, and some of these mistakes have been learned. Yet, I would say the West should be thinking about this all the time. This is a neighbor of Europe and Ukraine. It will not disappear. Geography will not be changed. And so it is in the interest of everybody that there is a pro-European society which lives there, a democratic society which doesn't want to launch imperial wars. And for that, the West will have to re-engage with whatever is the eastern neighbor of Europe and Ukraine, whatever it's called, in whatever borders it exists. And there should be a Marshall Plan for Ukraine, probably funded by Russian money. But there should also be a Marshall Plan for Russia, much more significant than it was in the 1990s. But I can go on for mistakes that Russians have made in the 1990s. I think we've learned a lot of them. We may still repeat them, but at least we know much more now than we knew in the early 1990s when it was an unprecedented transformation.
Thank you very much, Sergei, for this fantastic and very concrete talk. I love it very much. My question is about future Russian leadership. Is there any chance, any slightest chance that the future Russian leader after Putin will be from those people who are now in diaspora in their position? These people which are now, writing the plans for the post-Putin Russia, many of them. So is there any chance, or we should count only for these people which are now around Putin? Thank you.
Thank you. As somebody who worked in the BRD, I think Russia can learn a lot from successful post-communist transition of Central and Eastern Europe, where actually diaspora played a very important role. In many of these countries, prime ministers and presidents were people from these countries which were studying, working, sometimes even born outside of those countries, and came back to lead the transformation. So this is completely plausible. And short answer to your question is yes. So I think it's plausible. I don't see why not, and this is completely doable. Some people would say that the diaspora is out of touch with today's Russian life. This is correct. We have social media. We probably overinterpret how much we follow what's going on in Russia, but we don't see the quality of food. We don't see the advertising posters. You need to make more effort to actually understand the reality of living in today's Moscow. Even that can be done. And today, the scholars of Russia are going back to this Soviet model where you cannot travel, so you need to look at fossils. But this time it's digital fossils. So you don't need to travel, you just go through social media, you scrape Russian internet. And already actually here at Harvard, there is a project called Filter Labs, Filter Russia, led by Jonathan Tubner, who actually does this. In Washington, DC, in the George Washington University, there is a Russia project where one of the parts of this project is exactly this, to scrape digital life in Russia, and you can learn more. And in that sense, of course, the disconnect is much smaller than it was in 1970s or 80s. But to what extent Russian voters can vote for somebody who is now living in exile, I don't know. But we've not seen Russian voters voting in free elections for a while. Some people would say for more than 100 years. Speaking about just one election in 1917.
I have a question about the broader concept of a spin dictatorship, and perhaps the answer is in the book, in which case I will buy it. But I'm curious if a spin dictatorship is a stable, political system that can exist for long term, or if all spin dictatorships will ultimately either devolve into a fear-based dictatorship or swing back to a more democratic system when a leader has to choose between making a decision to actually spur economic growth or gets to the point where Putin's Russia was at, where the spin parts of a dictatorship could no longer pacify people.
Thanks. The answer is in the book. There is a chapter which is called Future of Spin, but to spoil it, we don't know, because it's a recent phenomenon. It's a recent phenomenon, so we don't have data on this. We have data on the content of speeches of spin dictators. We count words. We have data on polls in the dictatorships. We have data on the magnitude of repression and censorship. So lots of data which we used to have this book written and published. But this question is just too early to ask. Now we can speculate, and what we say when we speculate is spin dictators do face a problem. The problem is they need educated people for growth. Most spin dictatorships are middle-income countries. In middle-income countries, either you're stuck in middle-income trap and you lose popularity, or you need growth based on knowledge workers, on people with tertiary education, not just people who can read and write and work in the factory. You need creative class. And creative class is usually very informed. They know what's going on. And you need to either co-opt them, bribe them, which is costly, or you need to silence them through targeted deniable repression, but it's also costly and it's hard if there are many. And so you face this conundrum. You need more of these people for economic growth, which brings you popularity. You also need them to work in your propaganda machine, right? But you also hate them because they represent a danger for you. And this is something we can quantify. We can show that people in modern autocracies, people with tertiary education, are much likely to understand what's going on and much likely to be critical. Their quality of life is higher than people without higher education, but they're still critical of the regime. And so this is the conundrum. And that's why you may be right, and it's not a stable phenomenon. So we saw spin dictatorships moving to democracies like Armenia in 2018, Ecuador, but we also saw Venezuela, which moved back from Chavez, who was a typical spin dictator, to Maduro, who's a typical fear dictator. So Putin is not alone in this game.
Thank you so much for this. This has been a fascinating narrative that you've told, and I think it makes a lot of sense when you think about these people that lived through the 90s who would be compelled by the argument that only Putin can save it. But what if you're somebody who was born in 2000 and is only coming of age in 2018, 2020, you're now being sent to war? Does the spin dictatorship have a difference based on the generation of what they experienced in Russian history?
Thanks. Empirically, it's very hard to answer this question because younger people also have different media diet. And once you control for this, I think we don't find the age effect. So if you're a young person consuming TV news, I think you still like Putin. I don't remember exactly, but I think we did run this regression. And I think this is actually true. And people who lived who did not live in 1990s, know that 1990s were horrible because TV tells them. Now, if you watch YouTube channels, you may have a different story. But that also applies to people who are 60 or like me 50, who watch YouTube channels and don't consume propaganda in such an amount. So for me, it is the information channel that you use rather than your age. But it's striking. That started to change already in mid-2000s when you saw that youngest generation who did not have the actual experience of 1990s started to be much more pro-Putin because they consumed too much propaganda and they saw that the economy is successful. And at that point, you saw a non-linear relationship between age and support for Putin, where people would say of my age were most critical, and people both younger and older would be less critical of Putin.
Thank you very much, Sergei. And I just want to start by echoing Alexandra's comment at the beginning. We're incredibly fortunate to have somebody who has, on the one hand, your depth of knowledge about the Russian economy, but is able to translate that in a way that the rest of us can understand and that's immediately relevant to policy. So thank you for that. On oil sanctions, it is goshki-mushki, and I think that there are additional steps being undertaken now, and we're seeing some better compliance in terms of Western tankers and the prices they're getting. But I had a broader question about the comments you're making at the very end, the KGB colonel or general who comes to power eventually, or as part of a junta, and his winning strategy to differentiate himself is to reopen to the West again. And of course, for anybody who follows Russian economic history, and you do better than most, we see this cycle of perestroika and repression that goes back to the 1850s when Glasnost was first formed. And after the first Crimean War loss, there was a major restructuring as Russia recognized they had to open back up to Western capital, Western technology, Western industrializations. But since then, we've gone through 4 or 5 cycles of opening and reclosing. And each time, as soon as the private sector, as soon as civil society gets strong enough, and I see Professor Graham is here, and I recall Pyotr Bolchinsky, who is the great turn of the century figure of the type of technocrat who would lead a democratic reform. He was in the provisional government briefly, of course. Yet they crack down again. The state learns new tricks of how to control industry and to demand loyalty once again from the technocratic elite. How do you see things changing this time? Can we break this cycle, and what would it take to have that KGB general eventually cede real power to civil society, if civil society even exists still?
Thank you, Craig. On oil sanctions, I think we are in agreement that more should be done. And in this paper, which we co-authored, there are concrete ideas on this, but I still don't see. Maybe in October we'll already see impact. Maybe in November we'll see impact. But the third quarter was not good, and I'm scared. I'm really scared. And let's hope that you're right. And this time, cat and mouse game, we win. But on your question, I fully agree. And usually, I don't have that with me today, but usually I would show this cartoon. I think it's from the Economist magazine, where you have the cycle of the bear, which occasionally goes up on a globe and says, "I'm a powerful bear," and then it falls down. It hits his head and is very unhappy, humiliated, and so on. And then at some point he gets his act together and again climbs on the globe and says, "I'm the greatest bear in the world." And so this is exactly the cycle we're talking about. The empire which gets humiliated and then tries to rebuild itself as an empire. And I think this war may change this exactly because there'll be a lot of reflection in Russian civil society, which discovers, interestingly, that we actually were quite imperialistic. We didn't know that. But this war is a war which may finally finish the imperialistic thinking of Russian civil society, I hope. I myself am not ethnically Russian, so for me it is quite striking that some people discover that ethnic Russians are not the most tolerant people in the world. The word pogrom is not... it probably came from Mars, we don't know. But overall, this is one source of hope. The other source of hope is globalization, the spread of new information technology, connectivity. And sometimes we should be scared of this. In this country, we see that that contributes to polarization. There is a famous paper published a couple of years ago where that was the first Facebook deactivation experiment. What they do, they take a big chunk of Americans, randomly select half and ask them not to use Facebook for a month, and then compare them to the control group. And they show that if you turn off Facebook, you're less politically informed, but you're also less polarized. And you're happier. That's another story. But overall, this is another battleground. And if we know how to regulate social media better, social media may actually contribute to democratic transformation in Russia as well, not just solving America's problems. So this is part of the issue. But I agree that we don't know. It may be another cycle. I think the way it's going to happen, at some point, this KGB general who will lead perestroika will be the one who knows that in case he loses the first free election, he will be able to retire, right? Not every KGB general today in the Kremlin has that, right? Some of these people know that they need to run away to Central African Republic or Emirates or Venezuela. But overall, regimes like this, when they transform, they lose control very quickly because they make mistakes. My co-author Dan Trisman actually wrote a paper which is called Democratization by Mistake, where he shows that majority of democratizations in the world were mistakes by the ancien regime, by the dictator. And that's completely normal. So in that sense, we may be optimistic regarding democratization, but as you said, consolidation of a free society, the irreversibility of this opening, this is what we should be worried about. And as a scholar, I think we've learned a lot from mistakes of 1990s and previous cycles. But of course, who knows? Future is not really easily predictable in that particular way. And we should worry about this and we should think about this. One of the things which I think played a very important role in the 1990s was corruption within the very core of the reformers' team, which undermined confidence in the reformers, confidence in democratic transition. And I think we should be very vigilant about this. Reformers should continue to have trust of the voters voters should know that the transformation is not done for people in the Kremlin, but for the whole society. So we should be more aware of inclusion as an objective of this reform. We see that even in Poland. Poland has had enormously successful transformation, and yet the issue of inequality eventually allowed for a political basis for anti-European forces. So things like this should be watched. We should think about these issues. So integrity and inclusion should be part of the project.
We'll take one more brief question. Seyun?
Oh, hi, thank you for this fantastic talk. You mentioned about the political impact of the invasion of Crimea, and it enhanced Putin's approval rate. But can you talk a little bit about what's the economic impact of the invasion of Crimea on Russia? Is there any economic rationale behind the invasion of Crimea, or is it just a huge financial sinkhole for Russia? Thank you.
Thank you. The answer is very simple. There was a political decision exactly for this reason. Exactly for this reason. Putin saw his popularity was his popularity was coming down as economic growth was slowing down, and so he needed some boost. And that worked. And I think it actually worked better than he expected himself and better than anybody expected. And this is the story of people studying Russian or Soviet textbooks of history, which suggested that we need to get Crimea back. Without that, Russia is not complete, something like this, right? But economically, no. It was costly for Russia. Sanctions that were introduced imposed a non-negligible cost, not dramatic cost, but a non-negligible cost. And of course, Crimea doesn't bring Russia any economic benefits. It's a beautiful place, but Russians actually were able to travel to Crimea before. You would be surprised, but Russians could buy property in Crimea before. And so there is no economic rationale in grabbing land. Russia still is the biggest country in the world in terms of land, right? So Russia doesn't need any more land, whatever Putin says.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Sasha. Thank you.
We now have a short coffee break. And by short, I mean get a cup of coffee and drink it on the way back. And we'll resume here at 10:45.